Welcome to the Trinity channel. My name is Dr. Tony Costa, and I will be joining you today dealing with a very interesting subject, investigating the Qur'an. And today we're going to be talking about the parallel texts in the Qur'an, whether or not they are in conflict with each other. Now, it's interesting that when we deal with our Muslim friends usually object to the Bible in saying that the Bible cannot be trusted, because when we look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we're told that they contain irrelevant texts or texts that are contradictory, or they contain stories in one Gospel that seem to differ with another Gospel. And so if you read the story of Jesus in Matthew, it may be different from that in Luke, or different from that in John or Mark. And what we usually hear is that, well, since we have these differences in the gospel accounts, we can't really trust them. Our Muslim friends will tell us that these are contradictions and that therefore the gospels are unreliable. Now, of course, the Quran speaks about the gospel being the Injil, and this is one of the books that the Quran says was revealed by Allah to Isa al-Masih, to Jesus the Messiah. But the problem with this view, of course, is that when we look at the Quran, and when it makes reference to the Injil, it assumes that the Injil is actually a book, and it was a book that was given to the prophet Jesus. Now, of course, the problem with this view is the fact that the word Injil, or the gospel, is not a book. The word gospel, from the Greek word euangelion, means good news. And the gospel is the good news about Jesus Christ. And the New Testament understands the gospel to be this message that Christ proclaimed and that he gave to the church to proclaim. And that gospel is the good news of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, as we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 4. Now, the problem here is that in the Quran, it assumes that the Injil, or the gospel, is a book. And the other problem is the fact that when we look at the Quran never quotes from the New Testament Gospels. There is no quotes that we find in the Quran quoting Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And this leads us to, of course, understand that Muhammad had no access to the New Testament as we know it today. And therefore, this complicates matters, because if the Quran is a book that is trying to correct the excesses of Christianity, then you would think that the Quran would at least accurately quote from our holy book, but it doesn't. And what this leads us to believe is that Muhammad did not understand the New Testament gospel. He simply assumed it to be a book. Now, the problem with this is that Muslims will claim that since we have 4 different gospel accounts, and it has different stories about Jesus' life or his preaching. For example, Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus is different than the account in Luke's gospel. There are some differences about who was told the news of Jesus' birth. Was it the shepherds in the field, according to Luke? Was it the Magi, according to Matthew, and so forth? And our Muslim friends will say, well, therefore, since we have 2 different accounts or 3 different accounts of a given event, well, therefore, the Gospels cannot be trusted. Well, that is not a problem for Christians, as we will see in a minute. This has never been a problem for Christians, because there is a legitimate answer to this. The problem, however, is that if we apply the same criterion that our Muslim friends expect us to apply to the Bible, we're going to find some very interesting results. For example, the Quran contains a number of stories within its pages that refer to the same event, but explained in different accounts. So, for instance, just to name a few, in the Quran we do have references to the story of Allah dialoguing, or Allah speaking to Adam. And we see this, for instance, in the Quran in Surah 2, verses 33 to 39, Surah 7, verses 19 to 25, and Surah 20, verses 115 to 123. You also see this in the commissioning of Moses by Allah. When Allah commissions Moses to go and bring the Israelites out of Egypt, you'll notice that the dialogue or the communication between Allah and Moses are not the same. If you look at Surah 20, verses 9 to 70, Surah 26, verses 10 to 51, and Surah 79, verses 16 to 25, you'll notice they're not the same. But instead of looking at all of these, I've chosen today to look at one story in particular out of this group, and that is the story in the Quran of the command by Allah to the angels to prostrate themselves before Adam when Allah made Adam. Now, what is interesting about this story, folks, is the fact that the story of the angels being ordered to prostrate themselves before Adam is not original to the Quran. In fact, this poses another problem because the Quran claims to be a text that has revelation, that its contents were sent down, they were revealed by Allah through Jibreel to Muhammad. And the problem with this view, of course, is that the Quran assumes that all of its contents are heavenly. They're not earthly in origin. But the story of the angels being ordered by God to prostrate themselves before Adam is a story that existed long before the Quran was written. In fact, it was a story that was very well known to Jews and Christians alike. And in fact, we have that story. It comes to us from an apocryphal text, that is a book or a text that was not canonical, not part of inspired scripture. And the name of this text was known as, in Latin, the Vitae of Adam and Eve. That is, the life of Adam and Eve. And in this story, this book, the life of Adam and Eve, that predates the Quran, it tells us about God commanding the angels to prostrate themselves before Adam, his image, but Satan refused to do so. And so that's a serious problem we have to take consideration of, because if the Quran came straight from heaven, from Allah to Muhammad, what is it doing with these stories that were very well known to the people of the day, of Muhammad's day, and they can be traced to other sources? But one in particular that I want us to look at in today's show is the story of Allah commanding the angels, including the devil, Satan, to prostrate themselves before Adam. And for our viewers' pleasure, we have provided this PowerPoint on the screen for you. And we're going to look at this topic: why do parallel texts in the Quran conflict? And so we want to take a look at this and look at these particular passages. We're going to look at this story. It appears 7 times in the Quran. And as you could see on your screens, it appears in Surah 2, verse 34, or Ayah 34. It appears in Surah 7, verses 11 to 18. It appears in Surah 15, verses 28 to 43. It also appears in Surah 17, verses 61 to 65. It appears once in Surah 18, verse 50, and also in Surah 20, verses 116 to 123, and lastly, in Surah 38, verses 71 to 77. Now, what is particularly interesting here is when we look at these texts, beginning with Surah 2, verse 34, I want you to notice the wording in these texts, and I also want you to notice not just the wording, but I also want you to notice what Allah says to the devil and what the devil says to Allah. And you're going to notice the words are very different. The accounts here, although they're talking about the same event, the words are very different. So here we're told in Surah 2 and verse 34, and when we said unto the angels, prostrate. Now the Arabic word there comes from the Arabic word sujud, which means to prostrate, and it's used usually of worship. So when Muslims perform sujud, when they prostrate with their heads to the ground, what are they doing? They are worshiping Allah. And here we have this very strange story in the Quran where the angels are told to do something to Adam that is usually only reserved for Allah, that is, for the worship of Allah. And we have a very strange story here, folks, because if the angels are being told to prostrate themselves before Adam, to do sujud, then we seem to have a case of shirk here, where the angels here are being commanded by Allah to commit shirk. In other words, Allah is associating a partner with himself. And in this case, the partner here would be Adam, who is considered a prophet in Islam. And so here we have a very strange story where Allah seems to be endorsing shirk on the part of the angels. So here Allah says, and we said unto the angels, prostrate yourselves before Adam. They fell prostrate, all save Iblis. He demurred through pride and so became a disbeliever. Now, Iblis here in the Quran is simply the Arabic word for the devil. And this word Iblis actually is not really an Arabic original. It's not originally an Arabic word. It is derived from the Greek word diablos. And the Greek word diablos is the word through which the Arabic word Iblis derives. It was borrowed from that Greek word. So much for the Quran's claim that it is a pure Arabic text. There are other foreign vocabularies in the Quran. Scholars have demonstrated this. And so it says here that Allah tells the angels to prostrate themselves before Adam, but Iblis did not do so. Now, the interesting thing that you should notice here is that Iblis is associated in Surah 2, verse 34 with the angels. Now, why is this a problem? It's a problem because according to Surah 18, verse 50, and that is a typo, folks, I apologize for that. It's Surah 1850, not 1851. In Surah 18, verse 50, Iblis is said to be one of the jinn. And in the Quran, the jinn and the angels are not the same beings. They're two different types of creatures. Jinn and men have a free will, and jinn are created from smoke. Angels are said to not be the same as jinn and humans. And so in Surah 234, we have a tradition here which it associated Iblis, the devil, with the angels. Notice it says the angels were told to prostrate before Adam. They all did so except Iblis. And the implication is that Iblis is one of the angels here. And this ties into the story that we find in the life of Adam and Eve, that apocryphal story, where in that story the devil, Satan, is actually identified as one of the angels. And so Iblis refuses to do so. He demurs from doing this through pride, and we're told here in Surah 234 that he became a disbeliever. And so it's important for us to realize that this is the first occurrence of the story that we find within the Quran. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll look at the second text in the Quran, Surah 7, verses 11 to 18. And you'll notice in this surah that Iblis refuses to prostrate himself before Adam because he says, I am better than him. That is, I am better than Adam. Thou createst me of fire, while him, that is Adam, thou didst create of mud. And in this story here in Surah 7, you have something that you don't find in the first passage. Iblis asks to be reprieved by Allah until the day of judgment. He states that he will ambush people from the right path, unlike what we find in Surah 2 and verse 34. So what we're going to do, folks, is we're going to continue this segment in a follow-up. And so this is the first part of investigating the Quran and looking at parallel texts that conflict within the Quran. It's our hope and prayer that our Muslim viewers will look at these texts and ask themselves the question, why do these texts relate the same event in different ways? And if they do so, is it fair to accuse the Christian Gospels of referring to the same events in the life of Jesus, but recording them differently? Let's find out in the next segment. Thank you for joining us.